Hi, this is Anthony. Welcome back to my show. Earlier today, I did a short video about the results of my recent viewers poll on Mike Rinder, and I encourage my viewers to seek out, if they haven't already, seen the video that I did about allegations that L. Ron Hubbard copied an obscure short story from a comic book that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby put out in the early 1960s through a company that eventually became Marvel Comics. One that has a character named Xenu, and which has a suspiciously similar story to that of the Ot3 story, and of course involves Xenu. If you haven't already seen it, I think that you would enjoy watching that video, and a lot of people have. Here are the results so far of my poll, which asked the question: after watching my video titled "Was Scientology's Xenu really created by Marvel Comics Stan Lee and Jack Kirby?" episode 336B, do you believe LRH copied the story of Xenu? So as I do this video, the poll has received 47 votes, and 94% of the respondents at this time think that LRH completely plagiarized the story of Xenu from the comic book, while 6% of the respondents, all with IP addresses from Clearwater, Florida — I know, that's just a joke, I can't see any information as to who responded to anything. Anyway, 6% say that they thought that it was just a total coincidence. So not too surprising as far as the statistics. Over time, they fluctuated only within a couple percentages of what they're currently at. A video that I wanted to do for a while was the infamous one on Aaron Smith-Levin's show, Growing Up in Scientology. And it's from about a month ago, entitled Mitch Brisker Has a Beef with Me. And I've actually created a poll for this one too, so I would love it if after you watch this video, and if you haven't already watched the one on Aaron's show, be sure to check that one out and make any determinations, or before you make any determinations. And I'll have a link to that show in my show notes. But I have to admit that it's going to be a difficult video to watch, his. Now, I believe that full disclosure and transparency is important, and I try to practice that on my channel here. If you've watched any of my videos related to the subject of the Aftermath Foundation fiasco and the people involved, you'll know that despite thinking that the board of the Aftermath Foundation likely did the right thing in removing Aaron Smith-Levin, I believe that it could have been done much better by both sides, so as not to result in the blowback that's happened. I think that Aaron's behavior was becoming a problem that could have harmed the organization, but obviously the circumstances of his removal, as they've slowly trickled out into the general public knowledge, has caused many supporters in the ex-Scientology and anti-Scientology world to turn against the Aftermath Foundation and its current board members, in particular the ones that are often mentioned, Mike Rinder and Claire and Mark Headley. I'm sure that their donations have taken a hit since Aaron is no longer on the board, but I wish that organization continued success, and I wish Aaron Smith-Levin success with the new foundation that he seems to be intent on creating. I think what everyone involved should take away, at least in part, from this situation is that nonprofit boards need to have serious thought put into them as far as whatever diversity and makeup needs to be associated with its membership. I've argued that, in my opinion, with a great amount of nonprofit and governmental board experience that I've had, that there was really nothing unethical for having so many married couples on the board. That the result of removing Aaron would likely be the same if the board was composed of people who did not have spouses on it. But as we've talked about so many times, the optics of having so many spouses is off-putting to many people on YouTube, at least. And all organizations involved need to seriously consider what is in their bylaws, what perhaps should be taken out or added in to make things completely clear and understandable as far as the duties and responsibilities of members of those organizations, and they need to have other policy documents that further elaborate where needed as to what is acceptable behavior and what is grounds for removal and what the process will be should that have to happen. Certainly, there's been a lot of concern over whether things that happen in people's private lives should be of any concern to the nonprofit that they help to lead. Many people think that just having a list of prohibited activities or something like that would be the solution and would be easy to create. One would think so, but as somebody who's had to spend many hours dealing with creating such documents, it's not as easy as one might suppose. This isn't actually the topic that I wanted to talk about today, but I'll get to the Mitch Brisker and Aaron situation in a minute. But let's think about what you would say should be grounds for dismissal from the board. Obviously, if a board member stole money from the foundation, that should be grounds for removal, right? I think most people would agree that if there was a fundraiser going on where people were coming up to the Aftermath Foundation booth at a county fair and handing over cash, and a board member was grabbing handfuls of cash out of the cash box and stuffing it in their pocket, that's a clear-cut violation, especially if somebody caught that on video on their phone. That would probably be an easy call to make. But what if the organization doesn't do a very good job of coming up with a budget and they don't have many categories or have it broken down so as far as how they're going to spend revenue? So there's no category for snacks or food or something along those lines. Now, I've actually had to man a booth at a county fair once, and it was in a poorly ventilated cinder block building during the height of summer, and it was extremely hot. Let's say that in the Aftermath scenario here, it's been a hot day, so I wouldn't begrudge anybody in the Aftermath Foundation spending a couple dollars on some bottles of water and maybe some snacks for the people that are sitting in the booth interacting with the public. Generally, something like that is 100% acceptable and an ethical use of money during the operation of public outreach or some type of board or staff meeting. But even then, sometimes you can start to get into kind of a gray area. And this is assuming that you've budgeted money in your annual budget to allocate for snacks or food. Let us say that over the course of the day, you have Mark and Claire Headley and Aaron and Ray Jeffrey, who is the lawyer that's on the board, helping out with the booth at the county fair. And I know that it's unlikely because they don't actually live in the same area, that they're spread throughout the country, but let's say that this is the case, that they're in Florida, in Clearwater. And let's say that they close up the booth at 7 p.m. They're tired, they want to go and relax, and so four of them meet at a local pizza parlor and want to talk about some of the things that have been brought up and maybe have some maybe they had some interesting interactions with people that they talked to. Maybe they got some ideas about something. Maybe they heard about somebody that wanted to leave Scientology or people that wanted to become major donors. So the four of them want to go to a pizza parlor where they get a pitcher of beer for $10 and a large pizza for $20, and the four of them eat it and discuss Aftermath Foundation business and the day's events at the booth at the fair. I think most people knowledgeable about the nonprofit world wouldn't have a problem with this scenario. And again, because they're not a public or governmental board, they can get together without public notice and talk about things. Slightly different scenario, the four of them talked about going to get a pizza and some beer, but Ray says that he has to go to court early in the morning and needs to get home. Aaron's considering going with the Headleys to the pizza parlor, but then he gets a text message and he decides not to go with them. So it's just Claire and Mark who end up going to the pizza parlor and spend $25 or $30. Now, they may discuss some Aftermath Foundation business. That may be the only thing that they really talk about. But the optics of them in this case, where they happen to be a married couple, even though in reality they're talking about information that they garnered at the booth, and so it's Aftermath Foundation business, how does the optics of them having dinner together without any other board members while using board funds to pay for the food and beer look any different than them just using board funds to have dinner as a couple rather than having a dinner meeting as two board members discussing business matters? I think in that case the actual ethics may say that it's okay, but the optics are not as forgiving. And again, as I pointed out, even though I don't think that it's unethical to have married board members on the board, I think that it would be better if they had a prohibition against it. The spouses of board members could still help volunteer, but the optics might look better to the public. Now, what if we had those 4 people and they talked about going out afterwards, and the Headleys said that they needed to get home and help their kids with schoolwork or something? Let's say that Aaron was having some issues and that he wanted to talk to Ray about them, since Ray is a board member and also a lawyer. And they were going to talk about Aaron's personal issues, but ones that related potentially to his continuing membership on the board. I think that this is a case because they're not a related party, such as being in a domestic partnership, that they're getting together to talk about matters related to the board, that would be an appropriate situation where money from the foundation, hopefully budgeted for this purpose, could be used for a meal. And since I mentioned that beer would be consumed, since that's a common adult beverage that's consumed with pizza, that brings up a good point. What, if any, amount of alcohol should be covered in the budget of a nonprofit? I think that on one board that I was on for quite a while, originally there had been a prohibition on spending any money on alcohol. I think that we may actually have changed that because we thought that there might be situations where, for instance, the executive director of our organization might need to meet with the managing director of a local theater, who is somebody who almost always drank some alcohol at dinner. And there might be useful times where a meeting with that individual would result in our organization getting the use of their space for free or at a discount, or other things which would have a greater return on investment than spending $10 or $15 on a drink or two for the gentleman during a business dinner. I don't even know if that actually ended up ever happening, but it's one of those things where when you're coming up with these rules, it's easy to say something like no alcohol, because we live in a country where we've had a gyrating history and relationship with alcohol, and a lot of people would just say nonprofit funds shouldn't be spent on alcohol. But if you were a theater group and you had a delegation of French actors come and visit you, not serving wine with their meal would seem to them as being on par with feeding them spaghetti without a spoon and a fork. Okay, I'm getting a little off track here. I want to give one more example, and then I promise I'll move on to Mitch. But I think that this is important because we're looking at things which might get somebody kicked off. And certainly when you're looking at morals, that's a very gray area. But when you're looking at the use of money, sometimes stealing money is clear as far as being a violation of what should get you kicked off the board. But misspending money can be more difficult, but ethically it could be close to the same thing as just stealing them. Now, let us say that we're back to our example of the 4 people that have been helping out over the course of the day at the booth: Mark, Claire, Ray, and Aaron. Let's say that the 4 of them were talking afterwards. They agree that they're hungry and thirsty. Aaron suggests that they go to the local pizzeria to debrief each other on what they learned during the day and relax for a bit. Everyone agrees that that would be fun, but Mark and Claire need to get home to do something with their kids. Ray needs to go home and prepare for court the next morning, so Aaron decides that he's going to go get some pizza. And let us say in this incident that he goes alone. Is it ethical that he spend nonprofit money on a meal after the event has concluded? The event being sitting at a booth at the county fair. And let's say that he hasn't just grabbed cash out of the donation box. Let's say that he pays with it with his personal credit card, which he then submits the receipt for reimbursement. So there's no secret as to what he's doing. It's completely above board, at least in his mind. While I don't think that most people would have a problem if he spent some money to get a snack or lunch while he's working at the county fair on behalf of the Aftermath Foundation, when he leaves, is it ethical to get a bite to eat before he goes home? I think that a lot of people wouldn't have a problem with that on ethical grounds because it's really related to his hard work at the fair. But obviously, if he did it right after the fair, that's different than if he did it on a night when he wasn't working at the booth at the fair. Let's look at another scenario, because I'm trying to impart here that there can be a million different scenarios where there are some very clear cut as far as being ethical and some times it's not so clear cut and as far as being unethical, and there's a lot of middle that's kind of gray in these situations. What if in the scenario Ray and Mark and Claire leave to go home, Aaron is gonna go have pizza and a beer or a Coke, and let's say that he is still in communication with his wife and calls her up and says, hey, I'm headed over to the pizzeria, I'm starving, I've been working all day at the fair, do you want to come over and meet me? And she says yes. She drives over and they meet, and he spends $30 on pizza and drinks. And again, we're talking about the scenario where all the organization funds are being used to compensate for the food and beverages. So, what are the optics of this? How does this look ethically? What if the conversation is Aaron is complaining about the humidity in the booth at the fair for a few minutes, and then the rest of the time they just talk about general family and life issues. She tells him that one of the toilets is running too long and needs to have the chain and the back part shortened so that it fills up faster and stops running, and a tree branch needs to be trimmed, and things like that. So there's no real Aftermath Foundation board business that's being tangentially discussed here. What's the ethics of using Aftermath Foundation money to pay for that if his wife, who's not a board member, is consuming food and drink? Probably not a reimbursable expense. But what if, however, Aaron is in the situation that he eventually found himself to be in, and he wanted to discuss with his wife the need to change their status publicly? That is, come out publicly to state that they've been separated for a number of years and are planning to divorce, and he discusses with his wife some of the issues that have come up before the board that may impact whether he stays on it or not. In this case, one could argue that some critical Aftermath Foundation board information is being discussed, even if it's not with a board member, but it's something that could dramatically impact the board. In fact, if a discussion like this had taken place a couple of years ago, then actually things may have turned out quite differently. Aaron perhaps could have moderated his behavior to a degree where he didn't get into risky situations because he wasn't trying to hide certain things on a moral level. Board members are aware that he's now a bachelor in this scenario. He ends up staying on the board, everyone is relatively happy, and he continues raising a lot of money for the board to carry out its mission. I personally would argue that if Aaron could have spent $30 having a beer and pizza with his wife a number of years ago to negotiate and solve some of these issues, that it would be well worth a minor investment for the greater good of the organization, whether or not the specific ethics of spending the money on a dinner with a non-board member spouse was optically optimal. Okay, I'm going to turn now to the discussion of Mitch Brisker, but just briefly. I believe that a lot of the controversy came from Mitch stating that he had a unique perspective on David Miscavige because while he was a Scientologist, he wasn't a Sea Org member, and he had a career before and outside of Scientology as a director. And so he was getting paid a lot of money to come in and direct and create films, which everyone else on the base was making like $47 a week and being treated terribly when Mitch wasn't. And because of the special status that Mitch had, where he could spend a lot of time around David Miscavige with few, if any, other people around, and Miscavige could talk to him in a certain way, Mitch believed that it gave him a unique perspective that other people didn't have, since he was the only person that was in that particular position. And I think that of some of the issues that come around using the word unique, it literally means one of a kind. And I think that in Mitch Brisker's situation, he did have a one of a kind perspective on a slice of the pie when it comes to privately observing and communicating with David Miscavige. But just because you have a unique perspective doesn't mean that it's the only perspective or that it's the true perspective. Certainly, Shelley Miscavige would have had a unique perspective also that might overlap certain things that Mitch observed, but obviously for various other reasons could be seen as a perspective of Miscavige that no one else but his wife or his communications officer or whatever her title was would see. And one could compare that to, say, the average Sea Org member who might work on the gold base at the time when they might have seen Miscavige, but you might have 20 or 30 of them who all basically had the same interaction and the same observations of Miscavige, and they may see things, especially when it comes to violence, that Mitch Brisker rarely or never saw. But their experience wouldn't be unique because, as I said in my made-up scenario, there might be 20 or 30 people in that situation. And so that's my gut feeling on what Mitch was trying to convey, even though he may not originally, when he first stated that, conveyed a full explanation to what he meant. I think that as far as Aaron, he took issue with Mitch thinking that he was unique and therefore the only person who could truly, fully understand David Miscavige, which is not what I understood Mitch to mean. And I'm sure that it's not what Mitch meant. But that's kind of what you get when you just jump to conclusions and you don't want to listen and consider what is really meant by somebody when they're speaking. And Mitch, I believe, later on admitted that he was not necessarily precise in all of what he said concerning that. And that kind of brings up an interesting concept within Scientology. It's because there's so many definitions and concepts and written works that have sometimes very detailed and sometimes very ambiguous policies or procedures or thoughts from Hubbard. And I think growing up and spending all your time reading and implementing those, if you work in some type of org, that you become very focused on the exact definition and intent of words. And if somebody in conversation makes a mistake in the precision of exactly what they mean, then somebody from a Scientology background, Aaron Smith-Levin in particular in our case, can start to get off on the wrong track when it comes to trying to just genuinely understand what the person truly meant. So here we have the question. I don't really want to speak much more on how I interpret the video because I want you to watch it yourself and then take the poll. If I just gave you my opinion, you might not think that there's any sense watching it. You just take the poll based on what I said. But I'll tell you that though it was likely, or it's going to be likely, a difficult video for you to watch, not because the subject is necessarily controversial like some of Aaron's videos, but just because of the interpersonal conflict between these two individuals is very uncomfortable to watch sometimes. Both of these people, especially Mitch, have a tendency to talk over the other person or just start talking when a thought enters their head, even if the other person is talking about something else or hasn't finished their sentence. I think that when somebody is being interviewed about what the interviewer thinks is a controversial subject, and it's clear that they're not truly understanding each other, then speaking out of turn and speaking over each other, and in Mitch's case, sometimes joking about things when Aaron wants to be very serious, can certainly lead to a fairly contentious interview. I had to stop the video a number of times and just go do something else before returning to it. Even if you have to do that, I would encourage you to try to get through the whole thing eventually. I think that you'll find it worthwhile. One last thing that I want to end with here, but that was brought up by watching that interview. Again, after the revelations of Aaron's departure from the Aftermath Foundation is when I watched this video again. It made me think of something. In the video and in some other videos that I've seen Aaron, he's taken issue with Mitch and other people who propose that David Miscavige is engaged in some type of intimate relationship with Lou, his current communication officer, or whatever the woman's title is. I think that we all know by now that in the Sea Org in particular, you can't have relations with somebody that you're not married to. And if you're married to somebody, then you can't have relations with someone else. And for much of what, or as far as what we know, there's no legal proof or any indication, other than supposition, that David and Shelley Miscavige have divorced. So in Aaron's mind, even if David and Shelley are permanently separated and she's exiled someplace never to return, As long as they're still legally married, David Miscavige wouldn't engage in any type of intimate contact with someone else, or else the people around him would see that as a betrayal or a violation of the important rules of the Sea Org. And probably many people from the Sea Org background who have grown up believing this would assume that that was true. And I think that that's how, at least up until recently, Aaron has seen it. However, in the real world, the top leader often gets to do whatever they want, even if it's a violation of the rules that everyone else has to follow. And unless someone else conspires to remove the leader, then the leader gets to do what they want. Saddam Hussein could create some morality rule that he makes his top generals and his cabinet members follow, but if he doesn't want to follow it, who's going to stop him? He had something like 14 different intelligence agencies to keep an eye on people and each other so that he wouldn't be overthrown by some element within Iraq. I believe that I've seen other people also agree with me, even if there's a strict moral policy within the Sea Org concerning relationships that is truly believed by everybody in Scientology management as a total outsider who doesn't have any insight into upper Scientology management than the rest of most of my viewers. I still think that David Miscavige can do anything he wants, violating whatever moral precepts that govern everyone else, and there's nothing anyone is going to do about it or can do about it. And another thing, it's interesting that Aaron was talking about this conception of morality that David Miscavige was bound by, but now we know that Aaron's been separated from his wife for about 4 or 5 years now. And I think most people, myself included, understand the situation and understand why he thought it was a good idea to try to present a public persona of somebody who was married. But it is kind of interesting now knowing what was going on to a degree in Aaron's life to look at his thoughts about Miscavige not being in a relationship with Lou through this lens. Okay. Anyway, the poll is up now. I would love it if you sought it out after watching Aaron's interview with Mitch. And let me know what you think about it. Of course, keep an eye on my other videos. Check them out. Hit the like button if you haven't already. Hopefully you've subscribed, and I would love to hear from you on anything you want to say. Please leave a comment. I eventually read them all, and I answer them when I have a chance. Thank you so much.